Hello, and welcome to Mythos and Logos. In 1849, in the dust-choked ruins of ancient Nineveh, a young Englishman named Austin Henry Layard brushed sand from a broken clay tablet and uncovered words that had been silent for over 2,000 years. These weren't just any words. They were the words of gods quarreling, of monsters rising from primordial seas, of heroes seeking what no mortal should seek. They were the first stories ever written down by human hands, pressed into wet clay when the world was young and the boundary between heaven and earth seemed thin as morning mist over the Euphrates. What Layard had discovered, though he didn't fully know it yet, was nothing less than the mythological DNA of Western civilization, the narrative seedbed from which would grow the stories of Genesis, the adventures of Hercules, the very concept of the hero's journey that still drives our movies and novels today. These Mesopotamian myths, carved in cuneiform script by scribes who believed their styluses were gifts from the gods themselves, represent humanity's first attempt to explain everything. Why we die, why we suffer, why the rivers flood, why love drives us to madness, and whether somewhere, somehow, immortality might be grasped by mortal hands. Tonight, we descend into this realm of primordial stories, where Tiamat, the dragon of chaos, births the universe in rage and salt water, where Gilgamesh, the king, walks the boundary between history and legend, where Inanna descends through 7 gates to confront her own sister Death. These are not distant, dusty tales for scholars alone. They pulse with immediate human concerns that would be recognized by anyone who has ever feared death, yearned for love, or stood beneath the night sky, wondering if the gods, whatever gods there might be, are listening. May I ask for your help? Liking and subscribing takes just a moment, but makes a huge difference for the channel. I'm grateful for your consideration. I'm also always amazed by our international reach, so I'd appreciate hearing where you're joining from and your local time. As drowsy peace settles upon you, we turn our hearts toward ancient Mesopotamia, 3,000 years before Christ, when the first cities rose from river mud and the first temples stretched toward heaven, when writing was magic and stories could make mortals into gods. The air itself seems thick with incense from 1,000 temple braziers, and the setting sun paints the ziggurat walls the color of fresh dates and burnished gold. Between 2 rivers, you are standing on a reed boat, floating down the Euphrates River in the year 2500 before Christ. The sun has just risen, painting the water bronze and gold, and the morning air carries the scent of river mint and distant cooking fires. Your feet feel the gentle rock of the current through the bundled reeds beneath you, and your hands grip a pole, worn smooth by generations of river travelers before you. This is Mesopotamia, the land between 2 rivers, and you are traveling through the heart of the world's first civilization. To your left, the eastern bank rises in a series of irrigated terraces, each one a green miracle stolen from the desert through human ingenuity and divine favor. Date palms stand in neat rows, their fronds whispering secrets in the morning breeze. You can see farmers already at work, checking the small canals that branch like veins from the river's great artery, ensuring that the precious water reaches every field of barley and wheat. The sound of their voices carries across the water, not the words but the tone, purposeful, collaborative, ancient. To your right, the western bank tells a different story. Here the desert presses closer, held back only by the river's gift. You can see a shepherd leading his flock to the water's edge, the sheep's bells creating a chaotic symphony that somehow harmonizes with the river's murmur. Beyond him, heat shimmer already rises from the sand, making the distant buildings of Uruk dance like mirages. But Uruk is no mirage. Its walls are real, baked brick by baked brick, each one marked with the seal of King Gilgamesh who ruled here, who walked these banks, who may have stood exactly where you're standing now, watching this same sun rise over this same river. The boat beneath you was made in the same way boats have been made here for 1,000 years, will be made for thousands more. Reeds gathered from the marshes, where the 2 rivers meet the sea, bound together with rope, and sealed with bitumen that bubbles up from the earth, like a gift from the underworld. Your pole strikes something beneath the water, perhaps a stone from some long-collapsed temple, perhaps a potsherd from a feast held when the gods still walked openly among humans. As you drift past a small temple complex on the eastern shore, you hear the morning hymn beginning. The voices of the priests rise and fall in a language already ancient, praising Utu, the sun god, for his return from his journey through the underworld. The sound makes something in your chest tighten with an emotion you cannot name, part longing, part memory, part recognition of something eternally human in these words of praise, sung as the world awakens. When writing began. The invention of writing in Mesopotamia was not a sudden revelation, but a slow revolution that took centuries to unfold, beginning around 3200 before Christ in the Sumerian city of Uruk. It started with accounting, not poetry, with sheep and grain, rather than gods and heroes. The first writers were not poets but bookkeepers, tracking temple offerings and trade exchanges, pressing small tokens into wet clay to record how many jars of oil were owed to Inanna's temple, how many sheep were sacrificed at the new moon. Picture a scribe in those early days, sitting cross-legged in the courtyard of the temple complex, a fresh tablet of clay balanced on his lap. The stylus in his hand is a simple reed, cut from the marshes and trimmed to a triangular point. When he presses it into the soft clay at different angles, it leaves wedge-shaped impressions, cuneiform marks that would give this writing system its name. His fingers are stained with clay dust and sweat beads on his forehead in the afternoon heat. He is doing something that has never been done before, capturing sound in silence, freezing words that once disappeared the moment they left the speaker's lips. At first, these marks were pictographic, little drawings that looked like what they represented. The sign for barley looked like a stalk of grain. The sign for a head looked like a profile. The sign for water resembled waves. But human thought moves faster than hands can draw, and soon these pictures simplified, stylized, became abstract. The head turned sideways, the barley became a series of lines, and most remarkably, the signs began to represent not just things but sounds. The sign for arrow, T, in Sumerian, came also to mean life, which was pronounced the same way. Language was learning to see itself. The scribal schools, called edubus, or tablet houses, became the intellectual centers of Mesopotamian cities. Young boys from wealthy families would spend years learning to master the hundreds of signs, practicing on recycled tablets that would be moistened and smoothed flat when the lesson was done. They copied proverbs and multiplication tables, legal codes and hymns. The discipline was harsh. One practice tablet reads, "The teacher beat me because my hand was not steady." But those who succeeded joined an elite class, the literate few who could commune with both the past and the future. What these scribes discovered, perhaps without fully realizing it, was that writing could do more than record. It could create. When they began to write down the old stories that had been sung by generations of storytellers, something changed in the telling. The stories became fixed yet somehow more free. A scribe could add a line of description that would have broken the rhythm of an oral performance, could develop a character's internal thoughts in ways that spoken words rarely allowed. The myths grew more complex, more psychologically nuanced, more human even as they dealt with gods. The cuneiform script spread throughout Mesopotamia and beyond, adapted by the Akkadians, Babylonians, Assyrians, Hittites, and Persians. Each culture made it their own, adding new signs, new grammatical constructions, new possibilities. By the time of Hammurabi around 1750 before Christ, cuneiform could express the full range of human thought and emotion, from legal contracts to love poetry, from medical diagnoses to messages from the dead. The Epic of Gilgamesh, first written down around 2100 before Christ, went through multiple editions, each scribe adding their own touches while maintaining the essential core. Consider what it meant for a story to be written down in a world where literacy was rare. These tablets were not meant for casual reading, but for preservation and performance. A single tablet might contain just one section of a longer work, requiring a collection to tell the full tale. The tablet with Inanna's descent to the underworld would be kept in the temple library, brought out on certain feast days, read aloud by priests who could bring the old words to life with their voices. The story existed simultaneously in clay and in air, fixed and fluid, eternal and immediate. The discovery that these tablets could speak again after millennia of silence is one of archaeology's great miracles. When scholars in the 19th century began to decipher cuneiform, they expected to find business documents and royal propaganda. They found those, certainly, but they also found a literature as rich and complex as anything Greece or Rome would produce, written 1500 years before Homer. The architecture of cosmos. The Mesopotamians imagined the universe as a vast architectural structure, solid and comprehensible, built according to divine blueprints that could be partially understood through careful observation of the heavens and the earth. Their cosmos was not infinite and abstract, but bounded and physical, a great house in which humanity occupied a small but significant room. This cosmic architecture shaped every aspect of their religious thought, from the design of their temples to the plots of their myths. At the foundation of everything lay the Apsu, the freshwater abyss, imagined as a vast underground ocean from which all springs and rivers ultimately drew their substance. This was not merely water, but the male principle of creation, the source of wisdom and the domain of Ea, god of crafts and intelligence. Above the Apsu sat the earth, a flat disk floating like a vast coracle on the freshwater sea. The earth itself was conceived as living matter, sometimes personified as a goddess, capable of bringing forth life when fertilized by water and seed. The sky arched over the earth like an enormous dome, solid as hammered metal yet somehow transparent, allowing the light of the celestial bodies to shine through. The Mesopotamians called this dome the firmament, and they believed it was made of a precious blue stone, perhaps lapis lazuli on a cosmic scale. Stars were etched into its surface, their movements tracking the will of the gods. Above this first heaven were two more levels: the middle heavens, where the gods held court, and the highest heaven where Anu, the Sky Father, dwelt in remote majesty. Between earth and sky moved the winds and storms, the domain of Enlil, whose breath could bring gentle rains or devastating floods. The Mesopotamians understood weather as divine communication, each cloud formation a word in a celestial language that skilled priests might partially decode. Thunder was the voice of angry gods, lightning their spears, rainbows their promises of reconciliation. The regular flooding of the Tigris and Euphrates was both blessing and curse, interpreted as the gods' annual judgment on human behavior. Below the earth lay the underworld, the land of no return, ruled by Ereshkigal and her consort Nergal. This was not a place of punishment, but of shadowy continuation, where all mortals, regardless of their earthly conduct, would eventually dwell. The dead were imagined as bird-like creatures, fluttering in darkness, eating dust and drinking muddy water, unless their descendants provided proper offerings. The underworld had its own geography, 7 gates that must be passed, rivers that must be crossed, a vast throne room where Ereshkigal pronounced the fate of each new arrival. What made this cosmic structure remarkable was how closely it mirrored Mesopotamian social and political organization. The universe was essentially a great estate, with Anu as the absentee landlord, Enlil as the active manager, and humanity as the workers. The gods had their own temples, their own families, their own petty disputes and grand alliances. They needed food, which humans provided through sacrifice. They needed praise, which humans offered through hymns. They needed houses, which humans built in the form of temples that were understood as literal residences for deities. The ziggurat, that distinctive Mesopotamian temple tower rising in stepped levels toward heaven, was an architectural representation of this cosmic structure. Each level represented a different sphere of existence, from earthly to divine. The temple at its peak was the meeting point between heaven and earth, where priests could ascend to commune with gods, and gods could descend to receive offerings. The very word ziggurat means to build high, and these structures were mountains made by human hands in a flat landscape. attempts to recreate the cosmic mountain where gods were born. This architectural understanding of cosmos extended to time as well as space. The Mesopotamians developed sophisticated calendrical systems based on lunar and solar observations, dividing the year into 12 months, the day into 12 double hours. They saw time as cyclical rather than linear, with creation constantly being renewed through ritual and sacrifice. The New Year festival, the Akitu, was not merely a celebration, but a reenactment of the original creation, ensuring that chaos would not reclaim the ordered world. Before all things, Tiamat and Apsu. Before the heavens had a name, before the earth was even a thought, there were only the waters, two vast beings of liquid chaos. Tiamat of the salt sea, female and fathomless, and Apsu of the sweet waters, male and deep beyond measure. They mingled their waters in an embrace that had no beginning, would have no end, until from their union came the first stirrings of form. In those primordial depths, where darkness was so complete it had weight and substance, Tiamat and Apsu discovered they were no longer alone. Within their mingled waters, like bubbles rising from an unseen spring, new beings began to form. First came Lamu and Lahamu, silt beings, neither fully liquid nor solid, creatures of the margin where waters meet mud. Then from them emerged Anshar and Kishar, the horizons, marking the first boundaries in a boundless existence. Anshar and Kishar, in turn, brought forth Anu of the sky, and Anu fathered Nudimud, whom later ages would call Ea, Lord of Wisdom and Sweet Waters, like his grandfather Apsu. With each generation, the new gods became more defined, more active, more disturbing to the primal peace. Where once there had been only the gentle mixing of primordial waters, now there was movement, noise, the clash of separate wills. The younger gods gathered in groups, laughing and planning, creating winds that rippled across Tiamat's surface, stirring up waves in Apsu's depths. Their joy was torment to the ancient ones, who had known only silence. Apsu, disturbed from his eternal rest, spoke to Tiamat in the old language that predated words. Their ways are painful to me. By day I cannot rest, by night I cannot sleep. Let us destroy them and return to the silence. But Tiamat, though she too was troubled, felt something a mother might feel, even a mother of chaos. How can we destroy what we have created? She asked, her voice like the sound of distant tides. They are noisy, yes, but they are our offspring. Let them be. Yet Apsu's rest had been broken, and broken rest breeds dark thoughts. With Mumu, his counselor, a creature of mist and schemes, he plotted in secret to end the disturbance permanently. But nothing in the cosmos can be kept secret from Ea, whose wisdom penetrates all waters. Ea learned of the plot, and with words of power that had never before been spoken, he wove a spell of sleep so profound that Apsu sank into a slumber deeper than death. And in that sleep, Ea killed the Ancient One, the primordial father, and built his dwelling place upon the corpse of the freshwater deep. The roar of chaos. When Tiamat learned of Apsu's death, something changed in the very fabric of primordial reality. The salt waters that had once moved in peaceful rhythms now churned with grief and rage. Her sorrow was not the weeping of later beings, but something more fundamental, the first grief, the template from which all future mourning would derive. The cosmos itself learned how to mourn through Tiamat's pain. The gods who had disturbed Apsu's rest now cowered before Tiamat's transformation. She who had defended them against her consort's anger now turned that same protective instinct into destructive fury. Her form began to change, no longer simply the salt sea, but something monstrous and magnificent. Some texts describe her as a dragon, others as a serpent of impossible size, still others as a chimera, combining all the fearsome aspects of creatures that would later populate nightmares. Around her gathered an army of monsters, beings born from her rage and salt tears. She created 11 creatures of horror: the viper, the dragon, the sphinx, the great lion, the mad dog, the scorpion man, the howling storm demons, the fish man, the bull man, and others whose names have been lost to time. Each was a violation of natural order, a mixture of forms that should not exist together, held in being only by Tiamat's will and wrath. She elevated Kingu from among her children, gave him the tablets of destiny that controlled the cosmos, and declared him her champion and new consort. The younger gods assembled in terror. They sent Ea to confront Tiamat, but he turned back at the sight of her transformation. They sent Anu, king of heaven, but even he retreated before her fury. The ordered cosmos they had been building seemed about to dissolve back into primordial chaos. In their desperation, they remembered Marduk, son of Ea, born in the deep waters built upon Apsu's corpse, a god who combined the wisdom of his father with a strength none of them possessed. But Marduk was cunning as well as strong. When the gods begged him to be their champion, he made demands that would have seemed outrageous in any other circumstance. If I am to save you from the ancient mother, if I am to risk my existence against the source of all waters, then I must be more than your champion. Make me your king, give me the power to decree fate. Let my word be law in heaven and earth. The gods, faced with annihilation, agreed. To prove his power, the gods set a constellation in their midst and challenged Marduk to destroy and recreate it with his word alone. Marduk spoke, and the stars vanished. He spoke again, and they reformed, perhaps in the same pattern, perhaps subtly altered. The texts are unclear. Satisfied, or perhaps simply desperate, the gods armed him with winds and storms, with a net to snare the ancient mother, with a bow that never missed its mark. The battle between Marduk and Tiamat was not merely a conflict, but a cosmological event that determined the nature of reality itself. When they met, the 11 monsters stood aside, for this was a duel that would either confirm the new order or return everything to primordial chaos. Tiamat opened her vast mouth to swallow Marduk whole, to return him to the waters from which all things emerged. But Marduk sent the evil wind into her mouth, inflating her body until she could not close her jaws. In that moment of vulnerability, he shot an arrow through her mouth, piercing her heart, ending the life of the mother of all. Twilight meditation on clay. As evening falls across the ancient city, a scribe sets down his stylus and holds a freshly inscribed tablet up to the dying light. The clay is still damp, impressionable, alive with possibility. Tomorrow it will be baked in the kiln, its words becoming permanent, unchangeable, eternal. But for now, in this liminal moment between creation and preservation, the tablet exists in a state of perfect potential. The story pressed into this palm-sized rectangle of river clay is the same one you have just heard. Tiamat's rage, Marduk's victory, the ordering of chaos into cosmos. But each time a scribe copies these ancient words, tiny variations creep in. A sign might be formed slightly differently, changing a nuance of meaning. A line might be added or omitted, reflecting the scribe's own understanding or the preferences of the priest who commissioned the work. The myth lives and breathes through these small changes, adapting to new times, while maintaining its essential core. Consider the weight of such tablets in your hands, heavier than you might expect. Cool to the touch, even in the heat of a Mesopotamian summer, the surface feels like dried skin, smooth in some places, rough where the stylus pressed deep. If you run your finger across the wedge marks, you can feel the confidence or hesitation of the scribe, places where he pressed firmly, sure of the ancient words, and places where the marks are lighter, perhaps where memory faltered, or where two versions of the story diverged. In the temple libraries, thousands of such tablets rest on wooden shelves, each one a frozen moment of storytelling, a whisper from the deep past. Some are broken, their stories interrupted mid-sentence, leaving us to wonder how they ended. Others are complete but solitary, the only surviving piece of what was once a longer work. The scribes who created them are dust. The cities where they worked are ruins, but their words endure, patient as stone, waiting to be read again. Marduk rises. With Tiamat dead, her body lying like a vast mountain range across the primordial waters, Marduk stood alone at the centre of existence, contemplating what to do with such a magnificent corpse. The 11 monsters she had created submitted to him, becoming his servants, their rage cooled by their mother's death. Kingu he bound in chains, taking from him the tablets of destiny that would give Marduk power over fate itself. But it was Tiamat's body that would become the raw material for a new creation. Like a master craftsman examining his materials, Marduk studied the ancient mother's form. Then, with the same precision he had shown in battle, he split her body in half like a shellfish. From her upper half, he created the heavens, stretching her skin to form the great dome of the sky, setting guards at its edges to ensure her waters would not escape to flood the ordered world. From her lower half, he fashioned the earth, using her bones as mountains, her blood as rivers, her eyes as the sources of the Tigris and Euphrates. But Marduk's creation went beyond mere physical architecture. He established the stations of the gods, giving each their proper place and function in the cosmic order. He created the constellations, those eternal markers by which time could be measured and destiny interpreted. He set the moon in its phases, the sun in its path, creating day and night, month and year, the very concept of measured time that would allow civilization to flourish. The gods rejoiced at this new order, but Marduk noticed their joy was tempered with exhaustion. The work of maintaining creation, of keeping chaos at bay, of ensuring the cosmic machinery functioned properly, was wearing them down. It was then that Ea, Marduk's father, whispered a solution that was both brilliant and terrible. Let us create a substitute to bear the burden of labour. Let us make beings whose purpose is to serve, that the gods might rest. They brought forth Kingu, who had worn the tablets of destiny as Tiamat's champion, and pronounced judgment upon him. For the crime of leading the rebellion against the younger gods, his blood would be the price of a new creation. They slaughtered him, and from his blood mixed with clay from the earth that had been Tiamat's body, they fashioned the first humans. These new beings were composite creatures, divine blood, giving them consciousness and will, earthly clay, making them mortal and bound to the physical world. Thus, humanity entered existence not as an afterthought, but as a solution to divine exhaustion created from the blood of a rebel god and the clay of a slain monster. This origin story explained to the Mesopotamians why humans were capable of both greatness and weakness, why they could conceive of eternity but were condemned to mortality, why they yearned for heaven but were bound to earth. They were living contradictions, bearing within themselves the echo of divine rebellion and the substance of primordial chaos, yet tasked with maintaining order through their service to the gods. Marduk's final act was to establish Babylon as the centre of the world, the axis mundi where heaven and earth met. Here he commanded the gods to build him a temple, the Esagila, whose top would reach toward heaven and whose foundations would root deep in the earth. This would be his dwelling place, but more than that, it would be the pattern for all temples, the model for how humanity should organize sacred space. The gods granted Marduk 50 names, each one a different aspect of his power, a different face of divine authority. He was called Asar, who grants agriculture, Asaraludu, who grants counsel, Namtila, who grants life, Namru, who grants brightness. With each name, his power expanded, until he contained within himself aspects of all the other gods. Some scholars would later argue that this was Mesopotamian religion's movement toward monotheism, though it never quite arrived there. Marduk was supreme, but not alone, king but not the only power. In Babylon's Great New Year festival, this entire cosmic drama would be reenacted. The priests would recite the Enuma Elish, the creation epic, in its entirety. The king would play the role of Marduk, undergoing ritual humiliation and then restoration, ensuring that the cosmic order would hold for another year. The people would celebrate with feasting and processions, knowing that they were not merely commemorating, but actually participating in the ongoing victory of order over chaos. This was the profound insight of Mesopotamian mythology. Chaos was not defeated once and forever, but had to be continually subdued through ritual, through proper service to the gods, through the maintenance of social order that reflected cosmic order. Every temple was a bulwark against the return of chaos. Every sacrifice a renewal of the contract between gods and humans. Every correctly performed ritual a small victory of Marduk over Tiamat. The implications extended into every aspect of life. When a Mesopotamian king claimed to rule by divine mandate, he was claiming to be Marduk's representative in maintaining order. When laws were codified and enforced, they were understood as extensions of the cosmic law Marduk had established. When cities were planned with their temples at the center and their walls forming protective boundaries, they were microcosmic versions of the ordered universe Marduk had created from Tiamat's corpse. Yet there was always an undertone of anxiety in Mesopotamian religion, a recognition that the victory over chaos was provisional. Tiamat was dead, but somehow still present in the salt sea that could flood and destroy. The monsters she had created now served Marduk, but retained their terrifying forms, reminders of what lurked at the edges of order, humanity itself. Created from the blood of a rebel god, carried within it the seed of potential rebellion. Order was not natural but imposed, not permanent but constantly maintained, not guaranteed but always at risk. This mythological framework gave the Mesopotamians a way to understand both the glory and the precariousness of civilization. They had built cities in a land where rivers could be both blessing and curse, where the desert pressed close, where nomadic peoples might sweep in at any moment to destroy what had taken generations to build. Their myths told them that such fragility was not a flaw, but a fundamental characteristic of existence itself. Creation was always and everywhere an ongoing process, a daily choice to maintain order against the eternal possibility of chaos's return. The Great Temple at sunrise. You wake in darkness, your body resting on a simple reed mat in the priest's quarters of Babylon's great temple complex. The pre-dawn air is cool against your skin, carrying the lingering scent of yesterday's cedar incense, mixed with the earthier smell of river mud from recent flooding. Your feet find the smooth mud brick floor, worn to softness by generations of priests who have made this same journey from sleep to service. Today is your turn to perform the morning awakening of Marduk. Moving through the courtyard, you feel the weight of ritual responsibility settling on your shoulders like a cloak. Other priests are already stirring, shadows among shadows, each moving with practiced silence toward their appointed tasks. Your hand trails along the wall, feeling the carved reliefs that tell the story of creation, your fingers finding the familiar grooves of Tiamat's death, Marduk's victory, humanity's formation from divine blood and common clay. These stories are not mere decoration but instruction, reminding you with each touch of your place in the cosmic order. The eastern sky shows the faintest blush of colour, not quite light, but the promise of light, as you climb the temple steps. Each step is deliberate, counted, part of the ritual that transforms you from mere human into the god's servant. By the seventh step, you are no longer yourself but a function, a bridge between the mortal and divine realms. By the 14th step, the city below has begun to fade into insignificance. By the 21st step, you stand before the great cedar doors of Marduk's earthly house. The doors are cool beneath your palms, their metal fixtures shaped like the 11 monsters that now serve Marduk. You speak the first words of awakening, ancient Sumerian phrases, whose exact meaning has been debated for generations, but whose power remains undimmed. The doors swing open on well-oiled hinges, revealing the antechamber where the morning offerings wait. Fresh bread, still warm from the temple ovens, date wine in silver vessels, the first fruits of the season arranged on plates of hammered gold. You lift the offerings one by one, your movements choreographed by centuries of tradition. The bread must be held at chest height, the wine poured in a continuous stream that catches the first rays of sunlight penetrating the chamber's high windows. As you move deeper into the temple, approaching the Holy of Holies where Marduk's statue resides, you feel the air itself grow thicker, charged with presence. Whether it is the god himself or simply the accumulated weight of human belief, something watches, something waits. The statue is massive, carved from rare wood and overlaid with gold, its eyes made from lapis lazuli that seem to track your movement. You begin the morning hymn, your voice starting as barely a whisper, but growing stronger as other priests join from adjoining chambers. The words speak of Marduk's journey through the underworld during the night, his battles with the forces of chaos that constantly threaten to unmake creation, his triumphant return with the sunrise to restore order for another day. Your voice becomes part of an endless chain of voices, stretching back to the first priest who sang these words, forward to priests yet unborn, who will continue the song when you are dust. Enlil's winds and Anu's stars. Above the earth but below the highest heaven, in the realm of wind and weather, Enlil held court as the executor of divine will, where Anu remained distant in the highest heaven, remote and perfect in his authority. Enlil was immediate, present, terrible in his proximity to human affairs. His very name meant Lord Wind, and in a land where wind could bring blessed rain or devastating sandstorm, his power was felt daily, intimately, inescapably. Enlil's mythology painted him as complex, even contradictory, much like the weather he commanded. He was the god who separated heaven and earth, creating the space where life could flourish, yet he was also the god who had once resolved to destroy humanity with the Great Flood. He gave kings their authority, placing the rod and ring of leadership in their hands, but he could just as easily topple dynasties with a shift in the wind's direction. He was civilization's guardian and its greatest threat, order's enforcer, and chaos's potential agent. In the city of Nippur, Enlil's chief temple, the Ekur, or mountain house, rose from the flat plain like an artificial mountain, its ziggurat reaching toward the middle heaven where Enlil dwelt. Here, decisions affecting all of Mesopotamia were ratified. A king was not truly a king until he had received Enlil's blessing at Nippur. The high priest of Ekur was said to hear Enlil's voice in the wind that whistled through the temple's upper chambers, translating atmospheric disturbances into divine commands. The mythology surrounding Enlil revealed the Mesopotamian understanding of power as fundamentally ambiguous. In one story, Enlil encounters the goddess Ninlil, bathing in a canal, and overwhelmed by desire, assaults her. The other gods, appalled by this violation of divine law, banish Enlil to the underworld, but Ninlil, now pregnant, follows him, and their journey through the underworld results in the birth of 3 more deities, including Nergal, who would rule the underworld, and Inanna, the moon god. Even divine crime could lead to necessary creation. Anu, by contrast, remained pure in his distance, the father of the gods, the personification of heaven itself. Anu was authority abstracted to its essence. His name was invoked in the most solemn oaths, his permission sought for the most significant undertakings, but he rarely intervened directly in earthly or even divine affairs. When the gods needed a champion against Tiamat, Anu attempted to confront her, but retreated, not from cowardice, but from a kind of cosmic propriety. Direct action was beneath his station, or perhaps beyond his nature. The stars were Anu's writing, each constellation a word in the celestial language that ordained fate. Mesopotamian astronomers, who were also astrologers, spent centuries mapping these patterns, creating detailed tables of stellar movements, predicting eclipses with remarkable accuracy. They identified the paths of the planets, which they called wild sheep for their wandering nature, and assigned each to a deity: Jupiter to Marduk, Venus to Ishtar, Saturn to Ninurta, Mars to Nergal, Mercury to Nabu. Yet for all their scientific precision, the Mesopotamians never separated the mechanical from the meaningful. The stars were not distant balls of gas, but the literal script of destiny. When a planet moved through a constellation, it was a god visiting another god's house, conducting business that would reverberate through the earthly realm. Eclipses were cosmic crises, moments when the normal order was suspended and anything might happen. Kings employed teams of astronomer priests, whose primary job was to watch for these celestial messages and interpret their meaning for royal policy. Between Anu's distant perfection and Enlil's immediate power, the Mesopotamians located the fundamental tension of existence, the need for both transcendent order and immanent governance, for both eternal law and temporal flexibility. Anu was the constitution of the cosmos, unchanging and supreme. Enlil was the executive who interpreted and enforced that constitution, sometimes harshly, sometimes mercifully, always with the wind's unpredictability. Inanna, love and war entwined. No deity in the Mesopotamian pantheon embodied paradox more completely than Inanna, known to the Akkadians and Babylonians as Ishtar. She was simultaneously the goddess of love and war, of fertility and destruction, of the morning and evening star. Her temples were places of sacred prostitution and strategic military planning, where the same priests who performed marriage rites might also bless weapons for battle. She was the most beloved and the most feared, the most human and the most transcendently divine of all the gods. Inanna's mythology suggests a deity who refused all limitations, who crossed every boundary, who claimed all opposites as her domain. Unlike other goddesses, who were defined primarily through their relationships to male gods, as wives, mothers, or daughters, Inanna stood alone, taking lovers but never truly married, bearing no children but mothering all creation through her fertility aspect. She was complete in herself, needing no complement, finding in her own nature all the contradictions that other mythologies divided among multiple deities. Her most famous myth, the descent to the underworld, reveals the dangerous ambition that drove her character. Already queen of heaven and earth, already possessing more power than any other goddess, Inanna decided she must also rule the underworld, the one realm that remained beyond her reach. The text is explicit about her motivation. She heard the funeral rites for Gilgamesh, the bull of heaven, and decided to attend, but this was merely pretext. She intended to conquer death itself, to add its crown to her collection. The preparations for her descent reveal both her power and her wisdom. She adorned herself with all the symbols of her authority: the crown of heaven, the lapis lazuli necklace of divinity, the breastplate of power, the gold ring of sovereignty, the rod of measurement that determined fate, the royal robe that marked her as queen. But she also instructed her faithful servant, Ninshuba, with remarkable foresight. If she did not return in 3 days, Ninshuba should raise a lamentation, beat the drums of assembly, and petition the high gods for her rescue. Inanna knew she was risking everything, but calculated that her value to the cosmic order would compel her rescue. Her encounter with her sister Ereshkigal, queen of the underworld, was not the reunion of siblings but the confrontation of opposites, where Inanna was life, sexuality, and growth. Ereshkigal was death, barrenness, and decay. Yet they were sisters, two faces of the same feminine power, divided by the cosmic order that Marduk had imposed. Their conflict was not personal but structural, inevitable given the nature of reality itself. The 7 gates of the underworld stripped Inanna of her power piece by piece, each gatekeeper demanding one of her divine attributes as the price of passage. By the time she stood before Ereshkigal, she was naked, powerless, reduced to mere essence without attribute. The judges of the underworld pronounced her guilty, though of what crime the texts never specify. Perhaps existence itself was crime enough in the land of the dead. Ereshkigal killed her sister with a look, and Inanna's corpse was hung on a hook like a slab of rotting meat. For 3 days and nights, the world above suffered Inanna's absence. Love ceased to function. Humans and animals alike lost all desire to mate. War ceased to have meaning. Warriors could not remember why they fought. The morning and evening star failed to appear, disrupting the cosmic rhythm. Creation itself began to wind down, entropy accelerating without the goddess who embodied life's contradictory vitality. Ninshuba, faithful to her mistress's instructions, petitioned the gods. Enlil refused to help, saying Inanna had overreached. Nanna the moon god likewise declined, unwilling to challenge the underworld's sovereignty. But Ea, god of wisdom and water, understood that Inanna's death meant cosmic catastrophe. From the dirt under his fingernails, he created 2 sexless beings, neither male nor female, neither alive nor dead, creatures of the margin who could slip into the underworld unnoticed. These beings found Ereshkigal in the throes of labour, giving birth to some unnamed horror, and they sympathized with her pain the first and only beings ever to do so. In gratitude, she offered them any gift, and they asked for the corpse hanging on the hook. They sprinkled Inanna's body with the food and water of life that Ea had given them, and the goddess revived, but her resurrection came with a terrible price. Someone must take her place in the underworld, for the land of the dead never releases its hold without claiming substitute. Inanna ascended, accompanied by demons, the Gala, who would ensure she provided a replacement. They encountered Nintuba first, dressed in sackcloth, mourning her mistress. Inanna refused to condemn the one who had saved her. They met Shara and Lulal, Inanna's beauticians, also in mourning, and these too she spared. But when she found her consort, Dumuzi, he was sitting on her throne, dressed in magnificent robes, showing no sign of grief for her absence. In rage at his indifference, she condemned him to take her place below. The story's conclusion adds layers of complexity. Dumuzi's sister, Inanna, volunteered to share his fate, each spending half the year in the underworld. This mythological explanation for the seasonal cycle also established a profound truth about love and sacrifice, about the prices paid for transcending boundaries, about the impossibility of having everything without losing something essential. The descent to darkness. Inanna stood before the first gate of the underworld, and even she, goddess of heaven and earth, felt a tremor of uncertainty. The gatekeeper, ancient Neti, examined her through eyes that had witnessed the passage of countless dead. "Why?" he asked, his voice like the grinding of burial stones. "Has Inanna, Queen of Heaven, come to the land of no return?" She lied with the smooth confidence of divinity, claiming she had come for the funeral rites of her brother-in-law, Gugalana, and Del, the Bull of Heaven. But Neti was not fooled. He had served too long at the boundary between life and death to mistake a mourner for a conqueror. Still, protocol must be observed. He instructed her to wait while he consulted his mistress, Ereshkigal, queen of the great below. In the throne room of the underworld, Ereshkigal received the news of her sister's arrival with a mixture of rage and fear. She knew Inanna had not come to mourn but to claim, not to grieve but to conquer. Yet the laws of hospitality, binding even in death's realm, demanded that a visitor be admitted. But Ereshkigal was clever in her bitterness. "Open the gates," she commanded Neti, "but follow the ancient rites. Remove her divine powers one by one. Let her enter, as all must enter here," bowed low. When Neti returned and announced these terms, Inanna's pride flared. She was accustomed to doors opening at her approach, to receiving tribute, not paying it. But she had come too far to turn back, invested too much of her divine reputation in this endeavour. "The ways of the underworld are perfect," she said, quoting the ancient formula. "They may not be questioned." At each gate, the toll grew heavier. First her crown, the visible sign of her sovereignty over heaven, then her lapis lazuli beads, each one containing a captured star. Her breastplate came next, forged from meteoric iron and inscribed with the names of conquered cities. With each removal, she felt not just the loss of an ornament, but the draining of actual power, as if these items were not merely symbols, but containers of her divine essence. By the fourth gate, where she surrendered her golden hip girdle, Inanna began to understand the true price of her ambition. By the fifth, giving up her gold ring of power, she knew she had miscalculated, but still she pressed on, driven by a will that had never known defeat. At the sixth gate, they took her measuring rod and line, the tools by which she determined fate. At the seventh and final gate, they demanded her royal robe, the last vestige of her dignity. 7 gates, 7 garments. The symbolism of Inanna's progressive stripping at the 7 gates has haunted religious imagination for 5,000 years, inspiring everything from mystery cult initiations to modern psychological interpretations of spiritual journey. Each gate represented not merely a physical barrier, but a metaphysical threshold. Each garment removed a layer of constructed identity until only essence remained. The first gate, where she lost her crown, was the dissolution of authority. In the underworld, no one ruled except death itself. The crown she surrendered was called the shugura, the desert crown, made from the horns of wild cattle and wrapped with divine wool. It was said that when she wore it, even the great gods lowered their eyes. Now it was merely an artifact, powerless as the skulls that littered the pathway deeper into darkness. At the second gate, her lapis lazuli necklace was taken, those deep blue stones that connected her to the heavenly realm. Lapis lazuli was more precious than gold in Mesopotamia, imported from distant Afghanistan, its colour matching the dome of heaven itself. Each bead was inscribed with one of her divine names, her aspects and attributes. As the necklace was removed, she felt those aspects diminishing, her multifaceted nature simplifying, reducing. The third gate demanded her breastplate, called the "Come Man, Come," a name that spoke to its dual nature as both protection in war and invitation in love. It was said to turn aside any weapon while simultaneously making her irresistible to any being she chose to seduce. Without it, she was vulnerable in ways she had never experienced, neither warrior nor lover, but something undefined, transitional. The golden hip girdle taken at the fourth gate was the symbol of her fertility power, the belt that marked her as the source of all generation. It was fashioned from the gold of 7 conquered cities, each link a testament to how desire could topple walls as effectively as any siege engine. Its removal was not just disrobing, but a kind of sterility, a severing from the regenerative principle she embodied. At the fifth gate, they took her golden ring, the circle of completeness, the symbol of divine perfection, without beginning or end. This was the ring with which she sealed destinies, marked contracts between gods and humans, blessed marriages, and cursed betrayals. Without it, her words lost their binding power. She could no longer decree fate, but only suffer it. The sixth gate's toll was perhaps the most profound, her lapis lazuli, measuring rod and line. These were the tools of divine judgment, the instruments by which justice was determined, reality measured, truth distinguished from falsehood. They represented not just power, but wisdom, the ability to discern and evaluate. Their loss left her unable to judge even her own situation accurately, stumbling forward on faith rather than knowledge. Finally, at the seventh gate, they demanded her pala dress, the garment of ladyship that marked her as royalty even among gods. This was not mere clothing, but a second skin, woven from the wool of sheep that grazed in paradise, dyed with the juice of flowers that bloomed only in divine gardens. It carried the scent of all her temples, the prayers of all her devotees. Removing it was like flaying, leaving her more than naked, rendered into nothing but raw, unprotected being. The journey through 7 gates also represented a descent through the 7 levels of existence, as the Mesopotamians understood them. Each gate was a transition from one state of being to another, from the fully manifest divine to something approaching pure potentiality, or perhaps pure vulnerability. The number 7 itself was sacred, representing completeness, the full cycle, the total transformation. When Inanna finally stood before Ereshkigal, naked and powerless, she was no longer the queen of heaven and earth, but something more fundamental and more fragile. The texts describe her as bowed low, a posture she had never before assumed. Yet even in this ultimate humiliation, something of her essence remained. She did not beg, did not plead, did not acknowledge her sister's authority. She simply stood, awaiting judgment, perhaps finally understanding that there were limits even she could not transcend. Whispers, in the house of dust. In the great below, in the house of dust and shadows, the dead exist in a state that is neither sleep nor waking, neither memory nor forgetting. They move through halls of dried clay with the rustling sound of autumn leaves, their forms translucent as smoke from extinguished offering fires. Their whispers fill the darkness, like the sound of wind through empty temples, speaking words that almost form meaning before dissolving back into sibilation. Here the great and humble share the same fate, eating dust for bread, drinking muddy water for wine. Kings still wear their crowns, but the crowns are made of shadow. Warriors still carry their weapons, but the weapons have no weight, no edge, no purpose. The beautiful still possess their beauty, but there are no eyes to admire it, no hearts to be moved by it. All distinctions that mattered in the world above become meaningless theatre in the democracy of death. The architecture of the underworld mirrors the world above, but in negative, temples that absorb rather than reflect light, palaces built from bones of forgotten dynasties, gardens where only pale mushrooms grow in soil, made from the decomposed prayers of the living. Rivers flow here too, but they flow backward, from mouth to source, carrying not life, but the memory of life, growing weaker with each circuit until they disappear into the primordial darkness that predates creation. Sometimes the newest arrivals speak of the world above, their voices still carrying traces of sunshine and wind, but these traces fade quickly in the house of dust, worn away by the constant whisper of older dead who have forgotten what light looked like, what food tasted like, what love felt like. They remember only that they once remembered these things, a recursion of loss that defines their eternal existence. Gilgamesh, the king who would not die. In the city of Uruk, around the year 2700 before Christ, there ruled a king whose name would outlive cities, outlive gods, outlive the very language in which his story was first told. Gilgamesh was 2/3 divine, 1/3 human, a mathematical impossibility that perfectly captured his existential predicament. Too godly to accept human limitations, too human to transcend them, he embodied the fundamental tragedy of consciousness, the ability to conceive of eternity, coupled with the certainty of death. The Epic of Gilgamesh exists in multiple versions spanning 1,500 years of cuneiform literature, from the earliest Sumerian poems to the standard Babylonian version preserved in Ashurbanipal's library. Each retelling added layers of psychological complexity, transforming what might have begun as simple hero tales into a profound meditation on mortality, friendship, and the limits of human ambition. The story that emerges from these layered texts is humanity's first great literary achievement, predating Homer's epics by a millennium. As the epic opens, Gilgamesh is a tyrant in the most literal sense, exercising his divine prerogatives without divine wisdom. He claims the right of first night, with every bride in Uruk, exhausts the young men with constant athletic competitions and building projects, and refuses to let the dead be properly mourned, as if grief itself were a challenge to his authority. The people cry out to the gods, not for his death, but for his distraction, for something or someone to absorb the terrible energy that is destroying their city, even as it builds mighty walls and temples. The gods' solution was elegant in its simplicity: to create an equal to Gilgamesh, someone who could match his strength, challenge his assumptions, and perhaps teach him the humility that comes from recognizing another as truly peer. Thus, Enkidu was fashioned from clay and water, shaped by Aruru, the mother goddess, and placed in the wilderness beyond civilization's reach. He was everything Gilgamesh was not: innocent where the king was cynical, wild where the king was cultured, content where the king was restlessly ambitious. Enkidu lived with the gazelles, running with their speed, thinking their thoughts, knowing nothing of cities or gods or death. His body was covered with hair like an animal's. His strength was pure and unconscious, his mind untroubled by questions that had no answers. He was humanity before the fall, before consciousness became self-consciousness, before knowledge brought suffering. He destroyed the hunter's traps not from malice, but from incomprehension, unable to understand why anyone would want to capture and kill the animals who were his companions. When a trapper encountered Enkidu at a watering hole, he saw something that terrified him more than any lion: a man who was not truly a man, a being who existed outside the social order that defined humanity. The trapper's father, wise in the ways of civilization, knew that such wildness could not be conquered by force, but only by seduction. He advised his son to go to Uruk, to the temple of Ishtar, and bring back Shamhat, one of the temple prostitutes whose sacred function was to initiate young men into the mysteries of sexuality, and, through that initiation, into civilization itself. Shamhat's seduction of Enkidu was not mere prostitution but a religious and civilizing act, For 6 days and 7 nights, they made love by the watering hole, and with each passing day, Enkidu became less animal, more human. When he finally tried to return to his animal companions, they fled from him. He had gained knowledge but lost innocence, gained language but lost his original tongue, gained the possibility of friendship with humans, but lost his fellowship with beasts. The transformation was irreversible. Shamhat clothed him, taught him to eat bread instead of grass, to drink beer instead of water, to anoint himself with oil like a civilized person. She told him of Gilgamesh, describing the king's strength, his beauty, his terrible loneliness that manifested as tyranny. Something in her description awakened in Enkidu a desire he had never known, not for power or wealth, but for companionship with an equal. He declared he would go to Uruk and challenge this king, not to destroy him but to test himself against him. Their first meeting was a collision of titans. Gilgamesh was approaching a wedding house to claim his royal prerogative when Enkidu blocked his path. They fought in the street like bulls, their combat shaking the doorposts, cracking the walls of buildings. The people of Uruk watched in terror and wonder as their oppressor met his match. But when the dust settled, something unexpected happened. As Gilgamesh finally threw Enkidu to the ground, as Enkidu acknowledged the king's supremacy, they looked into each other's eyes and recognized something that neither had ever seen before, themselves reflected in another. The friendship that followed was instant and absolute. Gilgamesh forgot his tyrannical ways, no longer needing to prove his superiority through dominance. Enkidu forgot his challenge, no longer needing to establish his worth through conflict. They became inseparable, completing each other in ways that made them both more human. Gilgamesh's mother, the goddess Ninsun, adopted Enkidu as her son, making official what their hearts had already determined. They were brothers in all but blood. But contentment bred restlessness in Gilgamesh. His divine two-thirds could not be satisfied with domestic peace. He proposed an adventure that would establish their names forever. They would go to the cedar forest, kill its guardian Humbaba, and bring back the precious cedar wood that Mesopotamia lacked. Enkidu, who knew the wilderness and its dangers, tried to dissuade him, but Gilgamesh's will was inexorable. The elders of Uruk counseled against it, but Gilgamesh heard only the call of immortal fame. Wild man of the steppes. Before Enkidu knew words, before he understood loneliness, before he learned that death was more than the stillness that sometimes overtook the elderly gazelles, he lived in a state of perfect presence. Each morning brought him to the same watering hole, where he would drink alongside the herds, his reflection indistinguishable from theirs in the churned mud. He knew every individual antelope by scent, every bird by its call, every predator by the particular quality of silence that preceded its approach. His strength was legendary among the hunters, who occasionally glimpsed him. He could outrun a gazelle in full flight, leap ravines that horses balked at, uproot trees that teams of oxen couldn't budge. But he used this strength without consciousness of it, the way a river uses its power to carve canyons, naturally, inevitably, without pride or purpose, beyond the immediate moment. When he freed animals from traps, he did so the way he would remove thorns from his flesh, as a simple response to wrongness, to the violation of the natural order he embodied. The transformation that Shamhat brought was not gradual but catastrophic, a shattering of existence that remade him entirely. When she revealed her body to him at the watering hole, something awakened that had always been dormant, waiting. It was not just sexual desire but the birth of desire itself, the recognition of lack, the understanding that he was incomplete. For the first time in his life, he wanted something he didn't have, needed something outside himself. After their 7 nights of lovemaking, when the animals fled from his transformed presence, Enkidu experienced the first of many griefs that would define his new human existence. He called to the gazelles in their own language, but the sounds that emerged from his throat were human words, foreign and frightening to his former companions. He tried to run with them, but his body had changed in subtle ways, no longer perfectly calibrated for wild existence. He had gained consciousness, but lost paradise, a trade whose full cost he would only understand when facing his own death. Yet what he gained was equally profound. When Shamhat spoke to him of Gilgamesh, when she described the king's loneliness, despite being surrounded by people, Enkidu felt something unprecedented. Empathy. He understood suffering he had not experienced, loneliness he had not felt, the burden of being unique. This understanding came with an irresistible compulsion to act on it, to seek out this kindred spirit, to offer challenge that was really offer of friendship. The cedar forest. The cedar forest stood at the edge of the world, where the sun rose each morning from between the mountain peaks, a place so sacred that the gods had appointed Humbaba, a monster of their own creation, to guard it against mortal intrusion. The journey there took Gilgamesh and Enkidu through landscapes that shifted from familiar to fantastic, from the irrigated fields around Uruk to wild places where no human footprint had ever pressed the earth. Each night of their journey, Gilgamesh performed ritual preparations for prophetic dreams. He would dig a well, scatter flour in a circle, pray to Shamash the sun god for visions of their success. But the dreams that came were terrifying. Mountains falling on him, wild bulls trampling him, thunderstorms that turned the world to chaos. Enkidu, with the optimistic hermeneutics of friendship, interpreted each nightmare as a positive omen, transforming Gilgamesh's unconscious fears into conscious hopes. As they approached the forest, the very air changed quality, becoming thick with the scent of cedar resin and something else, something that made their hair stand on end and their hearts beat faster. The trees were impossibly tall, their tops lost in permanent mist, their trunks so vast that 20 men holding hands could not encircle them. This was not merely a forest, but a vertical world, a place where the normal rules of space and perspective ceased to function. Humbaba's presence was felt before he was seen. His breath was fire, his voice was flood, his footsteps shook the mountain. The texts describe him differently in different versions, sometimes as a giant, covered in 7 layers of divine armor, sometimes as a creature whose face was made of writhing intestines, sometimes as something so terrible that human language could only approximate his appearance through contradiction and paradox. He was civilization's nightmare of untamed nature, nature's revenge on civilizing ambition. The battle was both physical and psychological. Humbaba tried to convince Enkidu to betray Gilgamesh, promising him lordship over the forest if he would turn against his friend. When that failed, he pleaded for mercy, offering to serve Gilgamesh, to provide him with all the cedar he could ever want. For a moment, Gilgamesh wavered, his essential humanity responding to the monster's unexpected vulnerability. But Enkidu, perhaps remembering his own transformation from wild to civilized, insisted that Humbaba could never be trusted, that wildness tamed was wildness waiting to reassert itself. They killed Humbaba with the help of Shamash, who sent 13 winds to blind and disorient the monster. As he died, Humbaba cursed them, particularly Enkidu, declaring that he would not grow old, would not outlive his friend. The curse seemed impotent at the moment of victory, but it would prove to be the pivot on which the entire epic turned. They had killed not just a monster, but a guardian, not just an enemy, but a protector of sacred space. The gods would demand payment for this violation. The cedar trees they cut down and floated back to Uruk were magnificent, their wood so fragrant that it could be smelled throughout the city, so durable that temples built from it would stand for millennia. But with each swing of the axe, they were destroying something irreplaceable, turning sacred forest into commodity, mystery into material. The great door that Enkidu fashioned from the finest cedar for the temple of Enlil was meant as propitiation, but it was also evidence of their crime. They had taken what was meant to remain untaken. Bull of heaven. The return to Uruk should have been purely triumphant. The city celebrated their heroes with festivals that lasted for weeks. The cedar from the sacred forest was used to build temples and palaces that would make Uruk the envy of all Mesopotamia. Gilgamesh and Enkidu were not just heroes, but exemplars of human achievement, proof that mortality could challenge divinity and win. It was precisely this hubris that brought divine retribution in its most terrible form. Ishtar watched Gilgamesh from her celestial palace and felt desire kindle in her divine heart. She had taken many lovers, both mortal and immortal, but Gilgamesh represented something unique: beauty combined with power, mortality touched by divinity, achievement that bordered on the impossible. She descended to Uruk and propositioned him directly, offering not just her love but elevation to divine status, a place beside her in heaven. Gilgamesh's rejection was not merely a refusal, but a comprehensive indictment of Ishtar's history with lovers. He listed them like evidence in a trial: Tammuz, condemned to die and resurrect annually; the bird whose wings she broke after loving its song; the lion she trapped in pits after admiring its strength; the stallion she had whipped and goaded after praising its speed; the shepherd she turned into a wolf; Ishulanu, the gardener, transformed into a mole. Each lover had been destroyed by her attention, transformed by her affection into something less than they had been. Ishtar's rage was cosmic in scope. She ascended to heaven and demanded that Anu, her father, give her the bull of heaven to destroy Gilgamesh. When Anu hesitated, warning that the bull would bring 7 years of famine, Ishtar threatened to break down the gates of the underworld and release the dead to outnumber the living. Faced with this apocalyptic blackmail, Anu relented, placing in his daughter's hands a weapon of divine vengeance. The bull of heaven descended on Uruk like a living natural disaster. With its first snort, it opened a pit that swallowed 100 young men. With its second, another pit consumed 200 more. The Euphrates River itself dried up as the bull drank it empty. The city that had celebrated victory now faced annihilation, punishment for its king's presumption in refusing a goddess's desire. But Gilgamesh and Enkidu had been transformed by their victory over Humbaba, elevated beyond normal human capability. They coordinated their attack with the precision of shared thought. Enkidu grabbed the bull's tail, while Gilgamesh, with the skill of a butcher priest, drove his sword precisely between the neck bones and horns, finding the one spot where divine creation was vulnerable to mortal weapon. The bull collapsed, and they tore out its heart to offer to Shamash, their patron deity. The celebration that followed was delirious but shadowed. When Ishtar appeared on the walls of Uruk to curse them, Enkidu tore off the bull's thigh and threw it in her face, an insult to divinity that could not go unpunished. That night, while the city feasted on the bull's meat, enough to feed the population for months, Enkidu dreamed of the gods in council, debating which of the heroes must die for their accumulated offences. The dream was clear. The gods chose him. Death's cold hand. The sickness came slowly at first, a morning where Enkidu woke feeling as if the bull's weight still pressed upon his chest. Gilgamesh, busy with the administration of Uruk and the distribution of the bull's bounty, barely noticed his friend's pallor. But day by day, the wild man who had wrestled lions grew weaker, his massive frame seeming to collapse inward, like a temple whose supporting beams had been removed. On the third day, Enkidu could no longer rise from his bed. On the seventh, he began to curse everything that had brought him to this point: the trapper who had discovered him, Shamhat who had civilized him, even the great cedar door he had fashioned for Enlil's temple. But Shamash spoke to him from heaven, reminding him of what he had gained: the friendship of Gilgamesh, the taste of bread and beer, the experience of being human, with all its joys and sorrows. Enkidu recanted his curses, blessing instead those who had brought him from wilderness to consciousness. As death approached, Enkidu described to Gilgamesh a dream of the underworld, a vision more detailed and terrible than any previous account. He saw the house of dust, where princes served as cupbearers, where high priests and acolytes squatted in darkness, where even the great gods of the underworld sat shrouded in shadow. He saw Inanna, who had tried to fly to heaven, now dwelling in dust. He saw ancient kings reduced to servants of the death god. Most terribly, he saw his own future, an eternity of separation from the one person who had given his life meaning. For 12 days, Gilgamesh sat beside his dying friend, holding his hand, speaking to him of their adventures, making promises about temples he would build in Enkidu's honor. On the 12th day, Enkidu's eyes clouded over, and his hand went slack. Gilgamesh could not accept it. He covered his friend's face with a veil like a bride's, then uncovered it, hoping to see breath. He felt for a heartbeat, until his own fingers went numb. He refused to let the body be buried for 7 days until a worm fell from Enkidu's nostril, the undeniable proof of death's dominion. Beyond the waters of death, you stand beside Gilgamesh at the edge of the world, where the cosmic ocean meets the shore of mortality. The journey here has stripped you both of every comfort, every certainty. Your feet are bleeding from crossing the desert of scorpions. Your skin is burned from passing through the garden of jeweled trees, where the sun itself grows like fruit. You have left behind everything that made you human, except the fear of death and the desperate hope that somewhere, somehow, immortality can be grasped. Before you stretches water, unlike any earthly sea, perfectly still, perfectly black, reflecting nothing, not even the strange stars that shine in this place beyond the world's edge. This is the water of death, and one drop of it touching mortal flesh brings instant dissolution. Yet, across this impossible barrier lies the island where Utnapishtim dwells, the only human who ever achieved immortality, the survivor of the Great Flood, who was granted eternal life by the gods. The ferryman Shanabi stands beside his boat, a vessel made from materials that don't exist in the mortal world, wood that never knew growth, sealed with pitch that never knew fire. He regards you with eyes that have seen 10,000 desperate seekers, all of whom turned back or perished in the crossing. But something in Gilgamesh's grief, still raw after months of wandering, moves him to agree to passage. The crossing requires stone figures, magical talismans, that can touch the water of death without being destroyed. You must pole the boat, never letting the water touch the oar, never letting the oar touch your skin. Each stroke must be perfect, for a single mistake means obliteration. Your arms ache with the effort of maintaining absolute precision. Your mind rebels against the impossibility of the task. Yet somehow, stroke by stroke, the island grows closer. When you finally reach the shore, Utnapishtim appears as an old man, impossibly old yet somehow vital, his eyes containing the weight of centuries, yet still capable of surprise. He looks at Gilgamesh's wild appearance, his hair matted with grief, his royal robes replaced by animal skins, his face gaunt with desperate seeking, and asks the simple question that undoes all heroic pretense. Why do you suffer so? The answer pours from Gilgamesh like water from a broken dam. Enkidu's death, the fear of his own mortality, the unbearable knowledge that all achievement is temporary, that strength fails, that beauty fades, that even the mighty walls of Uruk will someday be dust. You watch as the great king, 2/3 divine, stronger than any mortal, breaks down completely in front of this ancient survivor, weeping like the child he never was allowed to be. The plant of immortality. Utnapishtim's response to Gilgamesh's grief was both compassionate and crushing. He told the story of the flood, how he alone of all humanity had been warned by Ea to build a boat, to save his family and the seed of all living things. He described the terror of the 7-day storm, the waters that rose above the highest mountains, the gods themselves cowering in fear at the destruction they had unleashed. When the waters receded and his boat came to rest, the gods granted him immortality, not as reward, but as exception, a unique solution to a unique situation that could never be repeated. To prove that Gilgamesh could not bear the burden of immortality, Utnapishtim proposed a test. Simply stay awake for 7 days and nights. If Gilgamesh could not master sleep, how could he master death? The moment Gilgamesh sat down, exhaustion claimed him. He slept for 7 days, while Utnapishtim's wife baked bread each day, leaving the loaves beside him as proof of time's passage. When Gilgamesh woke and saw the bread in various stages of decay, from fresh to mouldy, he understood that he had failed even this simple test. Yet, Utnapishtim's wife took pity on the broken king. She convinced her husband to offer one last chance, revealing a secret that even most gods didn't know. Deep beneath the cosmic ocean grew a plant called the Old Man Becomes Young Again, a thorny growth that could restore youth if not grant true immortality. It was a consolation prize, but for Gilgamesh, it represented hope that death could at least be delayed. Gilgamesh tied stones to his feet and sank into the cosmic ocean, deeper than any mortal had ever gone. The pressure should have crushed him. The cold should have stopped his heart. But his desperate will carried him to the ocean floor where the plant grew. Its thorns pierced his hands as he grasped it, his blood clouding the water, but he held on and kicked free the stones, shooting to the surface with his prize. The journey home carried a different quality than his desperate seeking. Holding the plant, Gilgamesh began to plan, not for his own immortality, but for the restoration of his city. He would give the plant to the elders of Uruk first, let them regain their youth and wisdom. He would create a city where death was postponed, if not defeated, where knowledge could accumulate across extended lifetimes. For the first time since Enkidu's death, he thought beyond his own grief. When the gods grew weary. Long before the flood that would nearly erase humanity from existence, there was another time when the gods contemplated the destruction of their creation. This earlier crisis, recorded in the Atrahasis epic, revealed the fundamental tension in the relationship between divine and mortal realms. The gods needed humanity's service, but resented humanity's noise, required worship, but were disturbed by the very vitality that made humans capable of providing it. The story began before humans existed, when the lesser gods, the Agigi, were forced to maintain creation through brutal labor. For 3,600 years, they dug the channels of the Tigris and Euphrates, heaped up the mountains, separated the salt waters from the sweet. The work was endless, thankless, a divine chain gang that built the infrastructure of existence. Finally, led by Allah, god of strength, they rebelled, burning their tools, surrounding Enlil's house in the first labor strike in cosmic history. Enlil was prepared to destroy the rebels, but Ea proposed a more elegant solution. Let them create a substitute worker, a new being specifically designed for labor. Using clay from the earth and the blood of Geshtuer, a god who had intelligence but had joined the rebellion, they fashioned humanity. The mixture was crucial. The clay provided substance and connection to the earth, while the divine blood granted consciousness and the ability to understand divine commands. Humans were literally made to work, their purpose encoded in their very substance. At first, the solution seemed perfect. Humans took over the maintenance of creation, building temples, offering sacrifices, digging irrigation channels, growing the food that the gods consumed through burnt offerings. The Agigi were freed to be truly divine, to exist without effort, but humanity's success became its problem. They multiplied exponentially, filling the earth with their presence. Their noise, the din of cities, the clamour of markets, the cries of children, the songs of celebration, rose to heaven and disturbed Enlil's rest. Enlil's first attempt at population control was disease. He sent Namtara, god of plague, to thin humanity's numbers, but Ea, through his priest Atrahasis, whose name meant exceedingly wise, taught humans to focus all their worship on Namtara alone, flattering him with exclusive devotion until he relented and withdrew the disease. Humanity recovered and multiplied even more, their grateful celebrations louder than before. The second attempt was drought. Enlil commanded Adad, god of storms, to withhold rain. For 6 years, the fields turned to dust, rivers to trickles. Humans ate their own children in desperation. But again, Ea instructed Atrahasis to have humanity concentrate their worship on Adad alone, overwhelming him with attention until he released the rain. The recovery was swift, the population explosion that followed even greater than before. Enlil realized that as long as individual gods could be swayed by concentrated worship, humanity would always find a way to survive. The solution required unanimous divine action, something that would bypass individual divine mercy. He proposed, and the gods accepted the ultimate sanction, a flood that would erase humanity entirely. To prevent any warning, he bound all the gods by oath, not to reveal the plan to any mortal. But Ea was clever in his compassion. He couldn't warn Atrahasis directly without breaking his oath, so he spoke to the reed wall of Atrahasis's house, knowing the man was listening on the other side. He instructed the wall, not the man, to build a boat, to save his family and the seed of all living things. The subterfuge was transparent but technically maintained the letter of the oath while violating its spirit, a divine legal loophole that would save humanity. The flood, when it came, was more terrible than even the gods had anticipated. The Anunnaki, gods of judgment, raised their torches, setting the land ablaze before the waters arrived. Hadad's storms turned daylight to darkness. The south wind blew for 6 days and 7 nights, driving the floodwaters over the mountains. The gods themselves, terrified by what they had unleashed, fled to the highest heaven and cowered there like dogs. Ishtar, watching the destruction, wept for humanity, lamenting that she had agreed to their destruction. She called the other gods fools for following Enlil's plan, comparing humanity to flies floating in the water. Even Enlil, seeing the complete devastation, began to question whether the punishment had exceeded the crime. The gods, deprived of sacrificial offerings, grew hungry and weak, realizing too late that they had nearly destroyed the source of their own sustenance. The Deluge Tablet. When George Smith, a former banknote engraver working in the British Museum, discovered and translated the 11th tablet of the Gilgamesh epic in 1872, he found himself reading a flood story that predated the biblical account by over 1,000 years. The impact was seismic, challenging fundamental assumptions about the uniqueness of biblical narrative and revealing the deep mythological connections between Mesopotamian and Hebrew traditions. The tablet, broken and incomplete when Smith first examined it, contained Utnapishtim's account to Gilgamesh of how he survived the Great Flood. The parallels to the Genesis narrative were unmistakable. A divine decision to destroy humanity, one righteous man warned to build a boat, the preservation of animals, the sending of birds to find dry land, the sacrifice after landing, the divine promise never to destroy humanity again. Yet the differences were equally significant, revealing distinct theological worldviews. In the Mesopotamian version, the flood resulted from divine irritation at human noise, not moral corruption. The gods were divided in their decision, with Ea actively subverting Enlil's plan. The hero, Utnapishtim, achieved immortality as compensation for his suffering, not as reward for righteousness. Most tellingly, the gods were terrified by their own flood, cowering in heaven and lamenting their hasty decision when deprived of human offerings. Utnapishtim's boat was an exact cube, 120 cubits in each dimension, a shape that would spin uncontrollably in water, but perfect in its symbolic geometry. He was instructed to save not just his family, but craftsmen of every kind, preserving human knowledge and skill, along with biological life. The loading of the boat was described with mercantile precision. Silver, gold, all his possessions, as if he were emigrating rather than escaping, transferring civilization itself to a post-flood world. The storm itself was described with visceral terror that suggested eyewitness memory of some actual catastrophic flood, perhaps the periodic inundations that could devastate Mesopotamian cities. The south wind blew, the weapon of Hadad, the storm god. The Anunnaki raised their torches, setting the landscape ablaze with lightning. The dikes of heaven broke, releasing the waters stored above the firmament. Even the gods were frightened by the deluge's violence, retreating to the highest heaven, where they crouched like dogs against the outer wall. For 6 days and 7 nights the flood raged, and on the 7th day it subsided. Utnapishtim opened a window, and light fell on his face. He wept when he saw the devastation. Humanity returned to clay, the landscape flat as a roof, with mountain peaks appearing like islands in an endless sea. The boat grounded on Mount Nimush, and after 7 more days he sent out a dove that returned, finding no place to rest. He sent a swallow that also returned. Finally, he sent a raven that did not return, finding carrion to eat and land to settle. The sacrifice, Utnapishtim offered, upon leaving the boat, revealed the gods' dependence on humanity. They gathered like flies around the offering, starved after days without sacrificial smoke. Ishtar swore by her necklace of lapis lazuli never to forget the flood. Ea criticized Enlil for the excessive punishment, arguing that targeted consequences would have been more just. Let the sinner bear his sin, the transgressor his transgression, but don't destroy everyone for the noise of some. The resolution was transformative. Enlil, seeing Utnapishtim alive, was initially enraged that his plan had been thwarted, but Ea's eloquence convinced him that some humans must survive to serve the gods. In a unique moment, Enlil blessed Utnapishtim and his wife, touching their foreheads and declaring them no longer mortal but like the gods themselves, dwelling at the mouth of the rivers where the sun rises, forever removed from normal human existence. This removal was crucial. Utnapishtim's immortality was also exile, placed literally at the edge of the world, inaccessible to normal humans. He could never return to human society, never share his immortality, never father more children. He was preserved like a museum piece, a reminder of the flood, but not a model for human aspiration. His immortality was quarantine, ensuring that this exception to mortality's rule would never become precedent. Evening offerings. As twilight descends on the temple complex, the evening rituals begin with the lighting of sacred flames that will burn through the night, each one a small defense against the darkness that threatens to reclaim the ordered world. The priests move through their prescribed patterns with movements passed down through generations, each gesture pregnant with meaning accumulated across millennia. The offerings are arranged on golden plates, bread made from wheat grown in fields, irrigated by divine arrangement, beer brewed from barley that connects earth to heaven through fermentation's mystery, dates whose sweetness captures sunlight in edible form. The smoke of burning cedar rises from bronze braziers, its scent carrying prayers upward, creating a pillar of connection between the temple's earthly foundation and the celestial realm where gods hold court. In the inner sanctum, the statue of the god receives its evening meal with the same ceremony accorded a living monarch. The food is placed before the deity, curtains drawn to provide privacy for divine consumption. The priests know, with the dual consciousness that characterizes sophisticated religion, that the statue does not physically eat, yet something essential is transferred, some sustenance that maintains the cosmic order. The temple prostitutes perform their sacred functions as darkness deepens, their bodies becoming vessels for divine union, every coupling a reenactment of the primordial mingling that created existence. In the temple workshops, craftsmen continue their labor by lamplight, creating votive offerings that will carry the hopes and fears of worshippers into divine presence. Each small clay figure, each inscribed tablet, each woven garment becomes a material prayer. Nabu's stylus and Nisaba's grain. Among the younger generation of gods, those born after the cosmic order was established, Nabu held special significance as patron of writing, son of Marduk, secretary of the divine assembly. His stylus didn't just record but determined fate, each wedge mark in the clay of destiny, irreversible once impressed. In the scribal schools, every student's first successfully written tablet was dedicated to Nabu, a recognition that literacy was not just skill, but divine gift, participation in the god's own function. Nabu's mythology reflected the evolution of writing from a counting tool to cosmic force. Originally, merely Marduk's scribe, he gradually assumed greater power until, in some traditions, he surpassed his father, the writer becoming greater than the warrior. His temple in Borsippa, near Babylon, housed a library that rivaled any in Mesopotamia, its collection including not just religious texts, but medical treatises, mathematical problems, astronomical observations, and literary works. Knowledge itself was understood as Nabu's domain. The scribes who served Nabu developed a theology of writing that bordered on mystical. They believed that everything that existed had a written form in divine registers, that reality itself was a kind of text that gods could read and edit. When a scribe copied an ancient tablet, he was not just preserving information, but participating in the ongoing creation of reality. Errors in copying could have cosmic consequences, which explained the harsh discipline in scribal schools and the elaborate colophons, asking Nabu's forgiveness for any mistakes. Nisaba, goddess of grain and writing, represented an even older tradition, predating Nabu and possibly predating cuneiform itself. She was originally the goddess of reeds, the plant that provided both writing implements and measuring tools. Her dual nature, agricultural and intellectual, revealed the deep connection between civilization's two foundations, the ability to grow surplus food and the ability to record and transmit information. In one myth, Nisaba was measuring the heavens with her golden measuring line when she discovered that the dimensions didn't match what had been decreed. The discrepancy threatened cosmic stability, for if heaven's measurements were wrong, all earthly measurements derived from them would be false. She spent 7 years recalculating, checking her work against the movement of stars, the flooding of rivers, the growth of grain. When she finally found the error, a single misdrawn wedge in the primordial plans, her correction saved creation from gradual dissolution. The festival of first fruits, when the new grain was offered to Nisaba, was also when scribal students underwent their final examinations. The connection was explicit. Just as grain nourished the body, writing nourished the mind and society. Both required cultivation, careful tending, and proper storage. Both could be destroyed by neglect, water, or fire. Both connected past to future through the preservation and transmission of essential resources. Nisaba's temple libraries often adjoined granaries, architectural expressions of their parallel functions. Clay tablets were stored like grain in large jars, organized by subject and date. The librarians who tended these collections were priests of preservation, maintaining the intellectual seed stock of civilization. They understood that a broken tablet was like spilled grain, a loss not just of information, but of potential, of future growth that would now never occur. The relationship between Nabu and Nisaba was complex, sometimes collaborative, sometimes competitive. In some traditions, they were spouses, their union producing all written literature. In others, they were rivals, competing for scribal devotion. This tension reflected real institutional competition between different scribal schools and temple complexes, each claiming superior tradition, more accurate texts, better preserved wisdom. The Akitu festival. You stand among thousands in the great processional way of Babylon as the Akitu festival reaches its climactic day. The New Year celebration has been building for 11 days, and now, on the first day of Nisanu, the entire city throbs with sacred energy. Your body sways with the crowd's movement, a single cell in a vast organism that recreates the cosmos through ritual participation. The spring air carries the scent of 1,000,000 flowers brought from all corners of the empire, their petals strewn so thick that the streets appear carpeted in divine colour. The statue of Marduk has been brought from the Esagila temple, carried on a magnificent wheeled platform pulled by white bulls whose horns are sheathed in gold. The god's image, usually hidden in the temple's deepest sanctuary, now moves among his people, his lapis lazuli eyes seeming to observe each worshipper personally. You feel those eyes pass over you, and for a moment, the boundary between statue and deity dissolves. This is not representation but presence, not symbol but reality. Behind Marduk comes the king, but not as you've seen him before. Yesterday, he was stripped of his regalia, slapped by the high priest, forced to kneel and declare his innocence of various sins against the city and gods. This ritual humiliation reminded everyone, including the king himself, that power was not inherent but granted, not permanent but renewed annually through divine approval. Now he walks restored but chastened, his authority legitimate for another year. The procession moves toward the Bit, Akitu, the special temple outside the city where the sacred marriage will be performed. You know that within that temple, the king will unite with the high priestess of Ishtar, their coupling ensuring fertility for the coming year. This is not mere symbolism. The land's fertility literally depends on the proper performance of this rite. The years when the ritual was neglected or improperly performed brought drought, defeat, and disaster. As you walk, priests recite the Enuma Elish, the creation epic, their voices rising and falling in ancient cadences. You know these words, have known them since childhood, but hearing them now, in this context, they become incantation, recreating the cosmos with each telling. When they reach Tiamat's defeat, the crowd roars approval. When they describe humanity's creation, everyone falls silent, remembering their purpose as servants of the gods. The demons of chaos, actors in elaborate costumes, attack the procession at prescribed points, only to be defeated by actors representing the gods. These staged battles are simultaneously theatre and theology, entertainment and exorcism. Children scream in delighted terror as Tiamat's 11 monsters appear, then cheer as Marduk defeats them once again. The boundary between myth and reality, past and present, dissolves in ritual time where everything happens simultaneously: creation, destruction, renewal, dreams, and omens. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the boundary between sleeping and waking grows thin, the dream interpreters of Mesopotamia practiced their subtle art. Dreams were not dismissed as mere neurological static, but understood as communications from the divine realm, messages that required careful interpretation to yield their meaning. A king's dream could determine military strategy. A merchant's dream might guide trade negotiations. A pregnant woman's dream would predict her child's future. The dream priests maintained extensive libraries of dream symbols and their interpretations, tablets organizing thousands of precedents. If you dreamed of flying, it meant liberation from earthly concerns, unless you flew too close to the sun, which meant dangerous ambition. If you dreamed of flood, it could mean overwhelming emotion, material abundance, or divine punishment, depending on the water's color, speed, and your position relative to it. The same symbol could mean opposite things, depending on the dreamer's social status, profession, and the month in which the dream occurred. Beyond personal dreams lay the vast science of omens, the reading of divine will through worldly signs, the flight patterns of birds, the shape of oil dropped in water, the arrangement of stars, the birth defects of animals, the patterns in sacrificial smoke, all carried messages for those trained to read them. The omen texts, massive compilations that could fill entire rooms, attempted to codify every possible sign and its meaning, creating a grammar of divine communication. The most prestigious omen readers were the Baru priests, who examined the livers of sacrificed sheep. The liver, understood as the seat of emotion and thought, was a microcosm of the universe, its lobes and marks corresponding to cosmic regions and future events. A spot on the right lobe might indicate enemy approach from the east, while unusual coloration of the gallbladder could predict economic prosperity or collapse. The precision was remarkable. Trained Baru could identify over 60 significant features on a single liver. Yet for all their systematic approach, the Mesopotamians understood that divine communication was ultimately mysterious, requiring intuition as much as education. The best interpreters were those who could synthesize multiple omens, understanding that the gods rarely spoke with single voice, but rather through complex patterns that required both knowledge and wisdom to decode. The gods wanted to be understood, but not too easily, revealing their will to those who combined proper technique with genuine devotion. The Library of Ashurbanipal. In the year 668 before Christ, Ashurbanipal, last great king of Assyria, gave an order that would preserve the mythological heritage of Mesopotamia long after the civilization itself had crumbled to dust. He commanded that every significant text in every temple library throughout his vast empire be copied and brought to his palace library in Nineveh. The king, unlike his warrior predecessors, could read and write in both Akkadian and Sumerian, and he understood that true immortality lay not in conquered cities but in preserved words. The scale of Ashurbanipal's bibliographic ambition was unprecedented. His scribes travelled to ancient centres of learning: Babylon, Borsippa, Nippur, They negotiated with suspicious priests, who guarded their texts as jealously as treasure. When negotiation failed, royal authority compelled. Tablets were borrowed, copied with meticulous care, and returned, though sometimes the originals found their way to Nineveh despite promises otherwise. The king was creating not just a library, but an ark for the intellectual heritage of 3,000 years of civilization. The library's organization revealed a sophisticated understanding of knowledge management. Tablets were arranged by subject into distinct rooms: mythology and religion in one section, medical texts in another, astronomical observations in a third, historical chronicles in a fourth. Each tablet bore a colophon, identifying its contents, its source, and often a curse on anyone who would steal or deface it. Ashurbanipal's personal colophon read, "I have read and collated these tablets in the presence of the king, my lord. Whosoever shall carry off this tablet, may Shamash carry off his life." The copying process itself was an act of devotion. Scribes would purify themselves before handling ancient texts, understanding that they were not merely duplicating information, but participating in the transmission of sacred knowledge. When they encountered damaged sections, they would note the lacunae honestly, rather than inventing fill text. When multiple versions of the same myth existed, they would sometimes create composite editions, noting variant readings in small script between the lines, creating critical editions that would make modern textual scholars envious. Among the 25,000 tablets that would eventually comprise the library, the 12 tablets of the standard version of Gilgamesh represented the crown jewel. Ashurbanipal's scribes didn't just copy the epic, they edited it, organizing older Sumerian and Akkadian versions into a coherent narrative, adding the flood story as the 11th tablet, creating the version that would survive to modern times. They understood they were crafting something for eternity, a definitive edition that would outlive empires. The king himself spent hours in the library, reading ancient texts by lamplight, making personal annotations on clay tablets. He was particularly fascinated by omens and their interpretations, collecting thousands of omen texts that would help him navigate the increasingly troubled waters of his reign. The irony was bitter. All his learning could not prevent the collapse of the Assyrian Empire, which would fall within a generation of his death. When Nineveh fell in 612 before Christ to a coalition of Babylonians and Medes, the palace was burned, the great library seemingly destroyed. But fire, which destroys papyrus and parchment, only hardens clay. The tablets, baked in the conflagration that ended Assyrian civilization, became nearly indestructible. The library's collapse buried them under tons of rubble, creating perfect conditions for preservation. The disaster that ended Ashurbanipal's world ensured his library's survival. For over 2,000 years, the tablets lay buried, their languages forgotten, their script unreadable, their gods unworshipped. Above them, Nineveh became Mosul, Assyria became Iraq, cuneiform became Arabic. The great mound of Kuyunjik, which concealed the palace library, was known to locals as the place of ancient kings, but no one suspected the treasure of words beneath their feet. When Austin Henry Layard and his assistant Hormuzd Rassam excavated Kuyunjik in the 1850s, they found the library scattered across multiple rooms, tablets mixed with rubble, some broken into dozens of fragments, others miraculously intact. The initial reaction was disappointment. They had hoped for gold and statuary, not rooms full of broken clay rectangles covered in incomprehensible markings. Many tablets were shoveled into baskets like debris, shipped to the British Museum with minimal care. It would take decades for scholars to understand what had been found. The complete literary heritage of Mesopotamian civilization, preserved by royal ambition and historical accident. As cuneiform was decoded, as fragments were reunited, as texts were translated, the modern world gained access to humanity's oldest literature. Ashurbanipal's library became a time machine, allowing contemporary readers to hear voices that had been silent for millennia. The preservation was selective and therefore revealing. Ashurbanipal's interests shaped what survived. The great myths were preserved in multiple copies, while everyday correspondence was largely absent. Royal inscriptions dominated historical sections, while common people's stories remained untold. The library presented Mesopotamian civilization as its rulers wanted it remembered: grand, divinely ordained, eternally significant. Yet between the lines, in the margins, in the variant readings, carefully noted by ancient scribes, other voices could sometimes be heard. Echoes in Genesis. When Jewish scribes in Babylonian exile during the 6th century before Christ compiled and edited the texts that would become Genesis, they worked surrounded by the mythological traditions of their captors. In the scribal schools of Babylon, the Enuma Elish was still recited annually. The Gilgamesh epic still copied by students learning cuneiform, the great ziggurats still reaching toward heaven, with their promise of human access to divine realms. The Genesis authors knew these stories intimately and responded to them with sophisticated theological inversions that transformed familiar narratives into vehicles for count. Monotheistic revelation. The relationship between Mesopotamian myth and biblical narrative was not simple borrowing but complex dialogue. The Genesis flood account paralleled Utnapishtim's story in remarkable detail: the divine decision to destroy humanity, the selection of one righteous man, the precise boat specifications, the release of birds, the mountaintop landing, the sacrifice that pleased the deity. Yet every parallel contained a reversal. Where the Mesopotamian gods flooded the earth in irritation at human noise, Yahweh acted in moral judgment. Where multiple deities quarreled over the decision, one god acted with sovereign purpose. Where Utnapishtim achieved immortality, Noah remained mortal, but received a covenant that would endure forever. The Tower of Babel narrative in Genesis 11 presented the most direct engagement with Mesopotamian tradition. The description was precisely that of a ziggurat: baked bricks, bitumen mortar, a tower whose top would reach heaven. The builders' desire to make a name for themselves echoed the literal names of ziggurats like House of the Link between heaven and earth in Babylon. But Genesis inverted the Mesopotamian pride in these structures. What Babylon celebrated as humanity's greatest achievement, Genesis presented as hubris requiring divine intervention. The reversal was particularly pointed when compared to Mesopotamian texts like Enmakar and the Lord of Arata, where the god Enlil unified human language to enable great building projects. In Genesis, Yahweh confused languages specifically to prevent such construction. The scattering that Mesopotamian texts lamented as the consequence of divine anger became, in Genesis, the intentional creation of diversity, the origin of the nations detailed in the preceding chapter's Table of Nations. Where Mesopotamian mythology sought to explain how civilization concentrated in cities, Genesis explained why it dispersed across the earth. The creation account similarly transformed Mesopotamian cosmogony. The Enuma Elish's violent creation through divine combat became peaceful creation through divine speech. Tiamat, the primordial chaos dragon, became Tehom, the deep waters that God's spirit moved upon. Linguistically related, but theologically neutered. The cosmic battle was eliminated, replaced by serene sovereignty. The god's need for human servants became God's desire for human partners. Creation by divine committee became creation by singular will. Even the subtle details revealed theological confrontation. Mesopotamian texts described humans created from divine blood mixed with clay, explaining both human consciousness and limitation. Genesis described humans formed from dust and divine breath, maintaining the dual nature while eliminating the notion that divinity could bleed. Where Mesopotamian gods created humans to do the work they found burdensome, Genesis's God created humans to be images of divinity, partners in creation's stewardship. The Garden of Eden narrative engaged with Mesopotamian traditions about paradise and immortality. The Mesopotamian Dilmun, the pure land where Utnapishtim dwelt, became Eden, but accessible to humanity at creation, rather than reserved for exceptional immortals. The plant of immortality that Gilgamesh lost to the serpent became the tree of life that humans lost through disobedience. The serpent, wise and helpful in some Mesopotamian traditions, became the tempter whose cleverness brought death into the world. These inversions were not simple polemics, but sophisticated theology. The Genesis authors acknowledged the power and antiquity of Mesopotamian traditions while fundamentally reorienting their meaning. They accepted the narrative frameworks, the cosmic geography, even specific terminology, but transformed them into vehicles for monotheistic faith. The result was a text that spoke directly to audiences familiar with Mesopotamian mythology, while proclaiming something radically different about the nature of commoner, divinity, humanity, and the relationship between them. The genius of this approach was its simultaneous familiarity and revolution. A Babylonian Jew hearing Genesis would recognize the story's shapes, but encounter their meanings transformed. The cosmos remained structured, but was created through word rather than war. Humanity remained special, but through divine image rather than divine blood. The flood remained universal but purposeful rather than petulant. The diversity of nations remained divinely ordained, but as consequence of pride rather than cosmic accident. The excavator's lantern. George Smith held his lantern closer to the clay tablet, his hands trembling, not from the December cold in the British Museum's unheated storage rooms, but from the magnitude of what he was reading. It was 1872, and Smith, largely self-taught in cuneiform, was cataloguing Assyrian tablets from Nineveh. The account emerging from the wedge-shaped marks described a flood, an ark, a hero who was not Noah, but whose story was unmistakably parallel. Smith had always been odd, even as a child in Chelsea, preferring ancient history to playground games, teaching himself languages rather than learning his father's trade. His apprenticeship as a banknote engraver had given him the pattern recognition skills that made him exceptional at reading damaged cuneiform, seeing in broken signs what trained scholars missed. But nothing had prepared him for this moment, reading words that predated the Bible yet told its stories. The tablet was frustratingly incomplete, breaking off just as the hero released the birds to find dry land. Smith searched through thousands of fragments for the missing piece, his obsession growing with each passing day. He neglected his family, forgot to eat, dreamed in cuneiform signs. His colleagues thought him mad, this working-class autodidact who claimed to have found the Babylonian flood story. But when he finally presented his translation to the Society of Biblical Archaeology, the room fell silent, then erupted. The Times ran the story on its front page. The Daily Telegraph offered £1,000, a fortune, for Smith to go to Nineveh and find the missing fragments. It was an impossible task, finding specific pieces of broken tablet in mounds of rubble that had been picked over by looters for decades. Yet Smith went, driven by the same obsession that had carried him from engraver's apprentice to the British Museum. In the ruins of Ashurbanipal's library, working in heat that made his Victorian colleagues retreat to shade, Smith sifted through tons of debris. On the fifth day of excavation, May 14th, 1873, Smith found it, the missing fragment describing the ark's landing, the sacrifice, the gods gathering like flies around the offering. The piece had been sitting in the dirt for over 2,000 years, waiting for the one person in the world who could recognize its significance. Smith's triumph was complete but brief. He would die of dysentery on his third expedition to Assyria, aged 36. His last coherent words reportedly about tablets he had yet to translate. Names in the sand. The cities of ancient Mesopotamia lie beneath, tells artificial hills created by millennia of human habitation, each generation building upon the ruins of the last. Uruk sleeps beneath Waka, Babylon beneath Hilla, Nineveh beneath Mosul. The names have changed, the languages shifted from Sumerian to Akkadian to Arabic, but the locations remain fixed by the eternal rivers that first drew humans to settle and build. Walking these sites at sunset, when the oblique light reveals subtle variations in the soil, you can sometimes trace the outlines of ancient walls, the foundations of temples, the processional ways where gods once travelled in annual festivals. The sand shifts constantly, revealing and concealing. A pottery shard here, a brick with cuneiform inscription there, fragments of the vast text that was Mesopotamian civilization. The forgotten gods' names persist in unexpected places. Tammuz lives on, in the Hebrew month of Tammuz, Nergal in the Arabic name for the planet Mars. Ishtar became Esther. Marduk became Mordecai. Divine names humanized and preserved in biblical narrative. Even in modern Iraq, farmers still use the ancient irrigation techniques first developed for the gods' temples, channels, and water wheels that follow patterns established when writing was young. At night, the same stars that Mesopotamian astronomers charted still wheel overhead, following the paths they identified and named. The constellation they called the Bull of Heaven still charges across the winter sky. The Pleiades, which they knew as the star cluster, still marks the agricultural season. Their mathematical system, based on 60, still measures our hours and minutes, an unconscious genuflection to Sumerian genius every time we check the time. Modern Babylon dreams. You stand at the reconstructed Ishtar Gate in modern Babylon, its blue-glazed bricks gleaming in the afternoon sun, and for a moment, the centuries collapse. The dragons and bulls that parade across its surface are the same ones Nebuchadnezzar commissioned, though these are replicas. The originals residing in Berlin's Pergamon Museum. Tour buses idle, where chariot wheels once rolled. The gift shop sells miniature ziggurats made in China. Yet something essential persists, some echo of ancient grandeur that modern reconstruction cannot entirely suppress. The Euphrates has shifted course since ancient times, leaving Babylon's ruins stranded like a ship in a desert. The river that gave the city life now flows a mile away, its waters diminished by upstream dams, its banks lined with concrete. You walk where Alexander the Great died, where Jewish exiles wept, where Hammurabi pronounced laws, but the ground beneath your feet has been excavated, reconstructed, sanitized for tourist consumption. In the rebuilt throne room, a guide recites facts in multiple languages, dimensions, dates, dynasties, but you find yourself drawn to the corners where reconstruction gives way to original rubble, where you can touch bricks that Nebuchadnezzar's workers laid, their fingerprints still visible in the clay. These unrestored sections speak more eloquently than any reconstruction, their very ruin a testament to time's passage and empire's impermanence. The modern city of Hilla presses close to the archaeological site, its markets and mosques, internet cafes, and cell phone shops, creating a jarring juxtaposition with the ancient ruins. Children play soccer in the shadow of what might have been the Hanging Gardens. Women in black abayas walk past the foundations of Ishtar's temple. The call to prayer echoes across ruins where different gods once received worship, the same human need for divine connection expressed in evolved form. As evening approaches, the tourist police begin herding visitors toward the exit, but you linger, watching shadows lengthen across the ruins. In this liminal moment between day and night, between ancient and modern, between myth and history, you glimpse what draws archaeologists and dreamers to these sites. The possibility that the past is not truly past, that the ancient stories still unfold in forms we only half recognize. The undying stories. The mythological patterns first articulated in Mesopotamian clay have proven more durable than the civilization that created them. The hero's journey that Gilgamesh pioneered appears in every culture's storytelling, from Odysseus to Luke Skywalker. The flood narrative has been discovered independently in cultures that never heard of Utnapishtim or Noah, as if some deep memory of catastrophe and survival is encoded in humanity's collective unconscious. Modern fantasy literature unconsciously recreates Mesopotamian mythological structures. Tolkien's Silmarillion, with its cosmic battles between order and chaos, its divine beings who diminish as the world ages, its emphasis on names and naming as creative acts, echoes themes first explored in the Enuma Elish, George R.R. Martin's Song of Ice and Fire. With its dragons and deep history, its sense that the present is a diminished echo of a more mythological past follows patterns established when Tiamat first rose from primordial waters. Video games have become unexpected vessels for Mesopotamian mythological transmission. Players battle Tiamat in Dungeons and Dragons, seek immortality like Gilgamesh in countless RPGs, build ziggurat-like structures in Minecraft. The medium has changed from clay tablet to digital screen, but the fundamental narratives persist. Chaos must be ordered, mortality must be confronted, the divine must be approached through monumental construction. In psychology, the Mesopotamian myths provide templates for understanding human consciousness. Jung saw in Tiamat the terrible mother archetype, in Marduk the hero who must separate from parental chaos to establish individual identity. The descent of Inanna became a metaphor for psychological integration, the necessity of confronting one's shadow. Gilgamesh's journey from tyranny through friendship to grief to acceptance became a map of masculine individuation. Contemporary poets continue to reimagine these ancient stories, finding in them vehicles for exploring modern anxieties. Gilgamesh searches for immortality in a world of climate change. Inanna descends into depression rather than the underworld. Tiamat rises as environmental destruction caused by human hubris. The myths prove infinitely adaptable because they address permanent human concerns: death, love, power, purpose, the relationship between order and chaos. The digital age has given these stories new life through unprecedented accessibility. Cuneiform tablets that once required physical pilgrimage to distant museums can now be examined in high resolution from anywhere with internet access. Machine learning algorithms are being trained to piece together fragments, potentially reconstructing stories lost for millennia. Virtual reality experiences allow users to walk through reconstructed Babylon, to stand before Marduk's statue, to participate in the Akitu festival. Academic translation has given way to creative adaptation, with poets and novelists retelling Mesopotamian myths for contemporary audiences. Each retelling changes the stories while preserving their essential structures, like variations on an immortal theme. The gods' names may be forgotten, their temples ruined, their worshippers dust, but their stories continue to shape how we understand ourselves and our place in the cosmos. Starlight on ancient waters. The Tigris and Euphrates flow on, diminished but persistent, their waters carrying the memory of all they have witnessed. At night, when modern lights fade and ancient darkness reclaims the Mesopotamian plain, you can stand by these rivers and see the same stars reflected that Sumerian priests consulted, the same constellations that guided Babylonian astrologers, the same celestial patterns that marked the seasons for countless generations of farmers, fishermen, and kings. The rivers' voices have changed over millennia, their channels shifted, their volumes decreased by modern demands, but something in their essential nature remains constant. They still carry silt from the same mountains, still flood in the same season, still support the same species of fish that fed ancient civilizations. In their persistence, they embody the continuity that underlies all change, the permanent beneath the transient. Reed boats, like those used 5,000 years ago, still ply these waters in the marshes of southern Iraq, their construction unchanged since before writing began. The marsh Arabs who build them are among the last living links to Sumerian culture, their lifestyle preserving techniques and wisdom that predate any written record. In their songs and stories, echoes of ancient mythology persist, transformed beyond recognition, but maintaining deep structural similarities. The night sounds along these rivers, the splash of jumping fish, the rustle of reeds in wind, the distant cry of water birds, create a soundscape that has remained essentially unchanged since gods were thought to walk these banks. It is a music that predates human melody, a rhythm that influenced the first poems, a natural harmony that suggested to ancient minds that the cosmos itself was ordered, purposeful, divine in its very structure. The eternal return. And so we return to the beginning, to primordial waters that preceded all distinction, to the moment before creation, when all was potential, nothing yet actual. The Mesopotamian insight that time is cyclical rather than linear, that creation is an ongoing process rather than a completed act, that chaos always threatens to reclaim order, proves particularly relevant in our current moment of ecological crisis and social upheaval. We are always one generation away from forgetting, one catastrophe away from having to rebuild, one moment of inattention away from losing what millennia have accumulated. Yet the very existence of these stories, their survival against impossible odds, suggests something equally profound about persistence, about the human capacity to encode meaning in transmissible forms, about the power of narrative to outlive its creators. Every tablet that survived the burning of Nineveh, every myth that crossed from Sumerian to Akkadian, to Hebrew, to Greek, to our own mongrel tongues, represents a victory over entropy. A small flame kept burning through the long night of forgetting. The gods of Mesopotamia no longer receive worship. Their temples are ruins, their priests' lineages extinct, but their essential function, mediating between human need and cosmic force, continues in evolved forms. We still seek patterns in apparent randomness, still construct narratives to make sense of suffering, still build monuments to transcendence, still gather in seasonal festivals to ensure the world's continuation. The names have changed, the rituals transformed, but the underlying structure persists. In our digital age, as we encode our own civilization into silicon and electrons, media as fragile in their way as clay tablets, we might wonder what will survive of our mythologies, our explanations, our desperate attempts to mean something in the face of cosmic indifference. Perhaps future archaeologists, human or otherwise, will uncover our data centers as we uncovered Ashurbanipal's library, piecing together fragments of our digital dreams, finding in our stories the same eternal concerns: love, death, power, transcendence, the fear that chaos will reclaim all we've built. The Mesopotamian myths teach us that such fears are justified but not final. Yes, Tiamat may rise again, the waters of chaos may overwhelm our careful constructions, but the very act of storytelling, of encoding experience into transmissible form, of creating order through narrative, is itself a victory, however temporary. Each time the Enuma Elish was recited, Marduk defeated Tiamat anew. Each time we tell these ancient stories, we participate in the ongoing creation of cosmos from chaos. I'm thankful you've joined me in visiting these distant memories. May ancient peace settle over you like a gentle blanket.